Hello there. In this video I'll go over 10 tips for beginner players to get better at the combat in Final Fantasy XIV. This is one of those videos that I've gotten a lot of requests for over my time running this channel, and so this video has been a long time in the making. Now, I'm not an amazing player myself, but I have played most of the duties that are out there, I have leveled every single job, and I have cleared the recent Savage tier with some okay damage numbers. It really isn't anything to write home about, but I still feel like I can give beginner players a good idea of what they can expect and what they should look out for while leveling. I think while many MMOs share similarities in their combat, there are some niche mechanics to Final Fantasy XIV in particular that continue to hold new players back. And I think with just a few tips you can be king or queen of Sprouts in no time. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The first tip is also by far the hardest one to get right for beginners. I see someone running around with no clue about this in the game every single day. This tip is about the actions every job has access to. Each job action is one of three types. There are weapon skills, spells, and abilities. Weapon skills and spells put other actions of the same types on cooldown. The time it takes for those weapon skills and spells to come back off of cooldown is called recast time, but it is generally referred to as global cooldown or GCD by the community. If you use an ability, on the other hand, no other action is affected. Because of that, we can put all actions into two categories. There are GCDs, global cooldowns, and OGCD, off global cooldowns. This is important because it dictates the flow of every single job's main rotation. To maximize the amount of casts you can do, you should be using GCD actions back to back. And this is where a lot of people struggle at first. See, it's very easy to just assume that all actions are equal and it doesn't really matter what you press at a given time. But because you can press abilities while the GCD is rolling, you are effectively losing possible casts if you use an ability in the place of a weapon skill or spell. There should never be a time where you're casting an OGCD ability when you could be casting a GCD ability. Whenever the global cooldown is ticking down and you're unable to use any weapon skills or spells, then it's time to use abilities, which are all off the global cooldown. You can fit up to 2 OGCDs between GCDs, and doing so is called weaving. Ideally, weaving is the only way you ever use any ability in the game. That's not it for this tip though. I think it's very important, so we're gonna go into some more detail. Because there's something you need to look out for when weaving. When you try to fit more than 2 abilities between GCDs, or use an ability too late inside the recast window, you run the risk of delaying the next cast by a little bit. This is called clipping and should be avoided at all costs. This happens because there's a 500 millisecond animation lock after using any action in the game that will not allow you to instantly cast another action. To use this tip to your advantage, you should go ahead and find all the GCD and OGCD actions on your job's kit and practice weaving in the abilities so the global cooldown never stops rolling. Start easy by casting a single ability between 2 GCDs, and once you're comfortable, give weaving 2 abilities a try as well. Just know that this can be vastly more difficult depending on how good your connection to the server is. And if it turns out you can't double weave cleanly for whatever reason, it's better to revert to single weaves. And actually most openers out there also have a single weave version. The next tip that I want to give you might sound silly at first, but let me explain. You need to hit the boss more. Now I know what you might say, it makes a lot of sense that you should hit the enemy more because that will deal more damage. Thank you, Jolson, for this wisdom. However, if it was this obvious, you would think people would get it right. Uptime is what sets the good players apart from the exceptional players. You want to start implementing this tip into your gameplay by thinking about ways that allow you to continue hitting the boss over the course of a fight instead of being forced to stop by mechanics. A good melee DPS or tank player mindful of their uptime will attempt to get one last hit in before leaving the dangerous area at the last moment. A caster may finish a spell before moving out of the AoE that spawned below them instead of cancelling it. There are so many different ways to gain uptime in different kinds of fights that it's impossible to break down in this video. But every time you're not casting, every time you're interrupting a spell, you're losing uptime. So going for uptime is super important for your overall damage. However, all of this has to be done in a way that is not overly greedy. As a player, you have to strike a balance, especially depending on the kind of content that you're in at the moment, between dealing as much damage as possible and not dying needlessly to mechanics that you could have easily avoided. You will find that many are more forgiving of having slightly lower DPS than messing up mechanics repeatedly. And especially when progging through more difficult fights for the first time, whenever you should be focused on learning mechanics, going too greedy can be at the detriment of your party. So this tip is focus on your uptime, but know the right time to do so. Keep it in the back of your mind that uptime is the thing that really makes the people that you queue with deal so much more damage than you. They really have the fight figured out and they have it optimized. And with enough practice and you learning the mechanics, you'll get to that point as well. Next up, we're going to talk about rotations. Many people who are new to MMOs might not even know the concept of a rotation. But let me break it down for you real quick. Almost all actions in your jobs kit have a time and place to be used that will maximize the amount of damage that you deal. While generally you could probably get away with only pressing half of your buttons, doing so is not really recommended. You should read your abilities and figure out the rotation. Luckily, there are many guides out there. You can find Discord communities such as The Balance, which have a bunch of guides for all the jobs on their Discord server. And if you're really struggling, you could probably ask someone in your FC for some tips. Once you have a general understanding of your job and its rotation, there's one thing that all beginners should do. The thing that's going to have you start really dealing a lot more damage than any other players with a similar amount of playtime is practicing your rotation on a striking dummy. You can find one of these very early into the game at Summerford Farms in Lonossia. Spend some time familiarizing yourself with your actions and without being distracted by mechanics. By being really good at instinctively hitting the right buttons, you're going to have a big advantage over other players. You'll be able to do so more consistently, maintaining your uptime, and also have more time to figure out mechanics as they happen. It's kind of like driving a car. Sometimes all it takes for a beginner player to improve heaps and bounds is to spend an hour on the dummy. Give it a try. Time and time again, I see new and veteran players with a complete disregard for where they position themselves in relation to the rest of the party. The first and probably worst mistake I see is players spreading out over the whole arena instead of staying relatively close together. This is important because there are various area of effect abilities that allies can use to help you, such as heals, damage buffs, or mitigation. While some mechanics require spreading out as a party, it is better to spread out only when absolutely needed and otherwise stay relatively close than doing the opposite. This will allow healers to keep everyone's health up more easily and ensure you don't miss damage buffs. This is especially important for ranged DPS. When I first switched from playing tank to trying machinist, I was running all over the place because I was so happy I could finally move around without dragging the boss behind me and being forced to essentially stay in the same spot. And I can tell you my healers hated every second of that. So don't be like me when I unlocked machinist and stay close to the healers so they don't rip your head off. At the same time, your positioning can also help you avoid mechanics, particularly if you're new to the game. Staying next to experienced players and seeing what they do can help you avoid incoming attacks. This is also true for experienced players. If you see many people running in one direction, chances are there's something incoming that you've missed. This will save you many deaths in the long run and it's really easy to implement. The last mistake that I see a lot in terms of positioning is people staying too close to the tank. Tanks in this game get bombarded with ground AoEs. They get hit by cleaves that deal AoE damage, and they get hit by tank busters that also deal AoE damage, and trust me, you do not want to stand inside of those. For our next tip, I want to talk about a little bit of a niche mechanic and help you figure out the hitbox in 14. The game uses many area of effect abilities that the players have to dodge. You might have noticed that by now. Most enemies have multiple of these, so it's crucial that you get really good at dodging them. When an AoE marker appears on the ground, anyone standing inside of it will take damage once it resolves. What some new players don't know about is that the damage is completely independent of the animation an enemy will do. The damage is in fact calculated the second the AoE disappears. You can imagine it like the game taking a photo of that moment. And any player whose hitbox is inside the ground AoE at that moment will take damage. This is called snapshotting. This means that even while an enemy is doing a scary animation, you're able to run into that animation as long as the damage has already been calculated. You can use this to your advantage in a few ways. For example, melee players can gain uptime by being able to get close to an enemy more quickly after they use a point-blank AoE. It's worth noting that the player's hitbox is less of a box and more of a dot. This is the approximate location of the dot. And if this is inside of an AoE, you will take damage. If it's outside, you're fine. That means you can theoretically be safe inside the tiniest space between AoE markers, provided you manage to be pixel perfect. For our next tip, here's something I was surprised to learn many people didn't know about. I realized this wasn't common knowledge when I got an angry comment under one of my healer guides about how my MP calculations for blah blah, it's very boring. Some actions will apply their damage or healing over a set period of time. Many players don't know the details of how this potency is applied, however. When you use an action that deals damage or heals over time, it will tick every 3 seconds, steadily applying its damage over the full duration. This means that actions have multiples of whatever potency is listed in their description. For example, the White Mage spell Regen applies a heal over time effect for 250 potency every 3 seconds. This leads to a potency of 1500 and not 250 as the commenter was assuming. So keep this in mind when you try to figure out your abilities. Next up is something for melee DPS, but other jobs are going to find this pretty interesting too, in case they ever play the role, and also to help melee DPS play around it. All melee DPS in 14 have so-called positionals. These are actions that deal increased damage when executed from the correct side of the boss, which can be either the rear or the flank. Actions that have positional requirements will tell you so in their description. To get a better understanding of why this is actually really easy to play around, let's have a look at this dummy. I mean, the target dummy. When you target an enemy, a ring will appear around them. If this ring is open at the back, opposite the arrow, which indicates the enemy's front, it means that positional requirements apply to this enemy. Some enemies, however, will have a closed ring, meaning all positional requirements are lifted, and your positional abilities are going to deal their full damage either way. The rear of the boss is the open end of the ring, while the flanks are either sides of the ring. To hit positionals, many beginner players will move to the very center or the very flank of the enemy. This is actually not required, because if they position themselves right where the ring starts, they would be able to move slightly towards the open side to hit the rear positional, and shift ever so slightly to the opposite side to hit the flank positional. This doesn't matter much on the dummy, but on larger enemies it can be helpful to avoid having to move around too much. When you're inside the boss's hitbox, positionals will still apply correctly, as long as your orientation along the boss's hitbox matches the positional requirements. In other words, continue positioning yourself along the ring inside the boss's hitbox and your positionals will still apply. It's also worth noting that whether the positional is hit or not depends on the time of using the ability and not the animation, so you can safely move away after pressing the button. For the next tip, we're going to talk about reviving other players or getting revived during combat. The aggressive combat reses are a fairly unique mechanic in 14, with all healers and the damage dealers Summoner and Red Mage having the ability to revive dead party members. Whoever gets revived gets inflicted with a debuff called Weakness. This reduces their primary attributes by 25%, effectively weakening their damage. If the player gets revived with Weakness active again, they instead get Brink of Death, which will reduce all primary attributes by 50%. This means that the single biggest damage loss in the game, not even figuring in the time that you're gonna spend dead, is actually dying. So while revives can easily save a run, excessive dying is still heavily punished in the game, and you want to avoid getting in that situation at all cost. One mistake I see new healers make a lot is trying to hardcast their revive, meaning they will stand still for the full duration of the cast. And keep in mind, revives are long casts of up to 8 seconds. While this can be good situationally to save runs, a lot of the time this is done at the risk of the rest of the party, because the player is unable to heal while casting. All jobs with the ability to revive others also have access to the roll action Swift Cast, which can be used just before the revive to turn it into an instant cast instead. Another trick that will save you many deaths is knowing about Raise immunity. After getting revived, the player is immune to most types of damage for about 5 seconds, which can be cancelled by using an action. Moving around during this time is fine, however. Keep this in mind whenever you get revived inside an AoE the next time or the boss is dealing raid-wide damage. Just don't panic, don't press any buttons, and you'll be fine. For our second to last tip, I want to talk about limit breaks. You may have noticed a weird bar that appears inside duties, which slowly fills up over time. This is the limit gauge. There are 3 bars to the limit gauge, and reaching each one of them allows the use of a different powerful limit break ability. Light parties, meaning 4 players, only have access to 1 bar, while full parties of 8 players have access to all 3. The effects of the limit break vary depending on your role, but to summarize it, casting tank LB3 will apply mitigation, healers will revive all dead party members to full HP and MP, or alternatively, if they weren't dead, they will just get full HP and MP, and magical as well as ranged DPS will deal AoE damage, and finally, melee DPS will simply deal a large amount of single target damage. Here it's important to note that damaging LBs ignore any damage buffs on the player and can't critically hit. So generally, it's a good idea to use this outside of damage buff windows. During boss fights, LB3 is generally safe for the melee DPS to deal a large amount of damage to the boss. However, healers should feel free to use it if multiple party members are down in an effort to save a run. The exception to this perhaps being when the boss is at really low health and one of the melee DPS is up and the melee LB might just finish him off. Magical and ranged DPS LB3 is used only rarely, but inside dungeons it's a good idea to spend LB1 on a large pack of enemies whenever it becomes available to clear the dungeon faster. This is generally better than using LB1 on the boss, and healer LB1 is pretty useless too. Essentially, as a new player, keep track of the limit gauge inside dungeons and trials and see if anyone uses it. Even experienced players tend to forget about the limit gauge every now and then. If they don't use it, feel free to use it yourself to not let it go to waste. It's not some sacred resource that's not supposed to be used by any sprout. The last tip that I have is mostly for healers. This is one thing that's very different in Final Fantasy XIV than in other MMORPGs. In this game, healers are generally expected by the community to contribute a lot to the overall damage, and the job designs absolutely allow you to do so. While healers generally don't deal as much damage as tanks or damage dealers, their contribution to the overall damage dealt is absolutely significant. It doesn't matter very early on into the game, but once you start tackling more demanding duties, lack of damage on a healer who only heals will become very obvious, and people will start calling it out. Now I understand if you're coming from another game and you used to only play healers and you're not used to it, or maybe you just don't play that many games and you don't feel comfortable to risk letting your party die, or maybe perhaps so far you've only had bad experiences with dealing damage in dungeons. It will just take some amount of time for you to get comfortable. Yes, there will be times when shit hits the fan and you'll be casting heals back to back. And this is especially true in early game dungeons, because a lot of the tanks don't understand that many of the jobs very early on don't actually have AoE abilities, so the pulls become much harder than they should be. In addition to this, very early on, you don't actually have that many abilities at your disposal. You're mostly dealing with GCD heals. Later on into the game, you start unlocking more abilities that allow you to heal while also damaging. So if you're not getting into this right now, give it a few levels and maybe your jobs will start making more sense in that direction. When I leveled my healers, the most fun part of the role for me was optimizing my play to get as much damage out of them as possible, while also keeping everyone alive. The only HP that matters is the last one. Those were my 10 combat tips for beginner players. If you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one, which YouTube thinks you will like for some reason. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.